Welcome back to Women Writers in Chinese History. This video introduces the period of division in Chinese history after the fall of the Han Dynasty, including a discussion of the famous legend of Mulan coming from the period. First, let's briefly review what we have learned about Chinese dynasties so far. We have mentioned that the first imperial dynasty was established by the first emperor of Qin when he unified China in the year 221 BCE. The Qin dynasty was short-lived due to its tyrannical policies. And after a short period of military chaos, Liu Bang founded the Han dynasty in 202 BCE. The history of the Han dynasty falls into two halves, the Western Han and the Eastern Han, due to the Wang Mang usurpation period in the middle and the relocation of the capital to the east. Adding its two halves together, the Han dynasty lasted over 400 years, up to 220 CE. The fall of the Han dynasty was related to corruptions at the imperial court and began with the peasant rebellion that broke out in 184 CE. This event was known as the Yellow Turban Rebellion, Huangjin Qi, since members of the rebel army all wore yellow turbans. Too weak to defend itself, the Han court called on local militia forces to fight against the yellow turbans. Many warlords rose to power during the process. Decades later, three major forces remained and established their dynasties. First, the Wei dynasty, established by Cao Pi in 220. Although the foundation of the dynasty was paved by his father, the powerful warlord and minister Cao Cao, who had been having the Han emperor in his control. Cao Pi's founding of the Wei dynasty officially put an end to the Han dynasty. Then, the Shu dynasty established by Liu Bei in 221 in southwest China, in today's Sichuan area. And the Wu dynasty established by Sun Quan in 222 in the lower Yanzi region of southern China. The eventful history of the Yellow Turban Rebellion to the founding of the Wei, Shu, Wu dynasties was recorded in the Chronicle of Three Kingdoms, Sanguo Zhi. This chronicle became the basis of the famous historical novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Sanguo Yanyi, which was written during the Yuan or Ming dynasty, more than 1,000 years after the Three Kingdoms period. As exciting as the heroic battles of the Three Kingdoms were, none of the dynasties that emerged from this history lasted long. The Shu dynasty was conquered by the Wei dynasty in 263. Yet for a long period of time, the Wei dynasty was under the control of a powerful minister Sima Yi and later his sons. In 265, the Sima clan finally took over the throne and changed the Wei dynasty to the Jin dynasty. In 280, the Jin dynasty wiped out the Wu dynasty in the south, thus temporarily unifying the Chinese territory. However, after about a decade, internal coup and external invasions resulted in the quick decline of the Jin dynasty. In 316, the northern half of the Jin dynasty was taken over by various powers established by non-Han ethnicities, that is, the Hu ethnicities, including Xiongnu, Xianbei, and so forth. 16 kingdoms, most ruled by non-Han rulers, were established in the north. The Jin dynasty continued in the southern half of its previous territory, and this period of the dynasty's history is called the Eastern Jin, since the capital was relocated eastward. The Northern Wei dynasty unified the northern territory in 439. Northern Wei was established by the Xianbei family of Tuoba and was not related to the earlier Wei dynasty during the Three Kingdoms period. Later, the North experienced several dynastic transitions, mostly owing to internal coup. The same political instability characterized the southern dynasties. The typical scenario is that the throne was taken over by a powerful regent or general after a palace coup. The Eastern Jin Dynasty ended this way in 419 and was later followed by formal dynasties in the south: Song, Qi, Liang, Chen. Historically, the period when the Han and the non-Han dynasties coexisted in the south and the north is referred to as Nanbei Chao, Northern and Southern dynasties. Here is a map of the two sides around year 500. The beginning of the Northern and the Southern dynasties period is traced to either the establishment of the first Northern dynasty, Beiwei, Northern Wei, in 386, or that of the first Southern dynasty, Song, or Liu Song, which replaced Eastern Jin in 420. Finally, the force that reunified China and ended the Northern and Southern dynasties period rose from the Northern territory. In 581, Yang Jian, a general of the last of the Northern dynasties, Northern Zhou, Beizhou, took over the throne and established the Sui dynasty. In 589, Sui overthrew the last of the southern dynasties, Chen, thus reunifying China. However, similar to the Qin dynasty before, the Sui dynasty did not last long and was likewise blamed for its tyrannical rulership, especially under its second emperor Sui Yangdi. The Sui dynasty officially ended in 618, replaced by the Tang dynasty. In ways that parallel the Han, the Tang dynasty is one of the most long-lasting dynasties in Chinese history and has been regarded as a golden age of economic and cultural developments. Ending in 907, its history is almost 3 centuries long and witnessed the rise of China's only woman emperor, Wu Zetian. We will look at Tang history and women's place in it in more details next week. Now, regarding the long period of division between the fall of Han and the Sui-Tang unification, we can see that dynastic politics were extremely unstable during this time, and there was a general sense of the loss of center or of orthodox transmission. Indeed, when there were so many forces competing for supremacy for so many centuries, where is the mandate of heaven? The political chaos were quite similar to those of the Spring-Autumn and Warring States period before the Qin unification of China. And likewise, dynastic instability stimulated new intellectual activities and cultural trends. For the period of division after Han, the most important trend that took place in both the North and the South was the spread of Buddhism, as well as the growing influence of Daoism. Understandably, in a period when life became so unpredictable, the Buddhist theology of salvation and the Taoist principle of detaching oneself from the illusion of this world became highly appealing to both scholars and the populace. Some dynastic rulers would also borrow ideas from Buddhism or Taoism to find divine justification of their power. Many of the finest and grandest Buddhist statues we have today come from the Northern and Southern dynasties. In another video, we'll look more closely at principles of Buddhism and Taoism and women's relations to these religions. A very distinctive characteristic of the northern and southern dynasties, on the other hand, was its multi-ethnic mixing between Han and non-Han populations and cultures. We have mentioned that most northern dynasties were established by non-Han ethnicities, although these dynasties assimilated Han population and Han influences. While maintaining their own ethnic traditions, some emperors of the northern dynasties also purposefully borrowed from Confucianism in devising their policies. One example of this kind is the Xiaowen Emperor of Northern Wei. In the south, the loss of northern territory resulted in a rise of Han nationalist sentiments towards drawing further distinctions between the Han and the Hu. Hence, scholarly literature and arts of the South became even more refined and introspective. We'll talk more about this trend in the next video. Yet, on the other hand, given that Buddhism was essentially of a foreign origin, coming from India and Central Asia, its spread in the South indicates influences coming from the North and the outside world in general. As to women's position in this period, we mentioned that non-Han women usually had greater freedom in the public sphere and were less restricted to Confucian ritual principles. This was quite true in the case of northern dynasties, during which it was rather common for empresses or empress dowagers to take charge of imperial politics. However, the North was still strictly patriarchal, and the throne was passed on according to male descent. No woman from the period actually claimed the title of the emperor. Another fact worth mentioning is that the famous legend of Mulan emerged during this period as a story from the northern dynasties. That is to say, from a non-Han ethnicity. This may be quite surprising to you if the version of the legend you're familiar with is the one reinvented by Disney, in which Mulan was a thoroughly Chinese heroine fighting against the Hans, that is, Hu ethnicities, from outside the Great Wall. In the original context, Mulan herself might be one of the Hans, and we're not sure who her real enemies were. The earliest version of the Mulan legend we have is from a short ballad dating to the 5th century and has been considered as a ballad first circulating during the Northern Wei dynasty. However, it's possible that the writing was from a later period and might have included older and newer lines. In the poem, we can also see a mixing of Han and non-Han customs. Here is the ballad itself. It starts with the scene of Mulan's weaving by the window, that is, doing a woman's work. Yet her shuttle has stopped, and she is sighing. An interlocutor, possibly her mother, asks what's on her mind, and she answers that there's nothing. Here, the ballad borrows a conventional opening from popular love ballads of the period. In a typical love ballad, the girl who has stopped weaving typically goes on to say that she has grown up and wishes to marry, or she's secretly in love with someone. In borrowing this formulaic beginning, the Ballad of Mulan subverts the reader's expectations, since Mulan's subsequent answer indicates that her worries have nothing to do with love or romance. As Mulan's answer goes, "Last night I saw conscription lists. The Khan is calling troops everywhere. The army's rolls were in 12 scrolls, and every scroll had father's name. 昨夜见军帖，可汗大点兵，军书12卷，卷卷有爷名." What's notable here is the reference to the dynasty's ruler as Kang or Ke-Han. This is a phrase used for the ruler of non-Han dynasties or forces. Then the poem portrays Mulan's purchase of a fine steed and other equipment for joining the army, thus indicating her transformation into the image of a male soldier. In the next part of the poem, we see her bidding farewell to her parents and travel to the northern border beyond the Yellow River. Interestingly, her parents seem to agree with her decision. She's not running away, as in the Disney version. Here are various images portraying Mulan as a male soldier. The left one is from the Qin Dynasty around the 18th century. The other ones are from the modern period. Then, the ballad describes Mulan's life on the battleground in just a few lines. She went thousands of miles to battle. She flew across fortified passes. The north wind carried the sounds of the watch, and cold light shone on her armor. After many a battle, the general died. After 10 years, the stout troops went home. The 10 years here is an approximate number. Later we see that Mulan spent 12 years in the army. The phrase, "the general died," is a conventional term portraying the perils of the battleground, rather than the actual death of any specific individual in Mulan's story. Furthermore, even though the English translation uses the female pronoun for Mulan, the original poem contains no reference to Mulan's gender, since pronouns are generally omitted in classical Chinese. Mulan's identity in the battleground scenes is thus more ambiguous in the original. The next stanza portrays Mulan's return to the imperial court. Interestingly, the poem first refers to the emperor as the son of heaven, Tianzi, and later as Kang, Ke-Han. This is a clear instance of mixing Han and non-Han terms. It might have appeared due to later addition by Han poets to an older Northern Dynasty poem. Also notably, unlike the Disney version, Mulan does not disclose her female identity to the emperor. She is referred to as the lad or in this scene, and even though the translation says that Mulan has requested a camel, the original term in the poem, 千里足, may refer to a horse. However, in the next scene, when Mulan returns home, she also explicitly returns to her female identity. That is, she is identified as a daughter and a sister. The poem reinforces this gender transition by portraying in detail her putting on her female clothes and makeup. She took off her buff coat for battle and put on the skirt she used to wear. At the window, she combed her wispy locks. In the mirror, she put on rouge. 脱我战时袍，着我旧时裳。当窗理云鬓，对镜贴花黄。Finally, she goes out to reveal her female self to her fellow soldiers. We marched together for 12 long years, and you never knew that Mulan was a girl. 同行12年，不知木兰是女郎。Finally, the ballad concludes with what appears to be Mulan's answer to her fellow soldiers. 雄兔脚扑朔，雌兔眼迷离。双兔傍地走，安能辨我是雄雌？ The male hare's legs have a nervous spring. The eyes of the girl hare wander. But when two hares run side by side, Who can tell if I'm boy or girl? The metaphor of the pair of hairs is extremely interesting, especially considering the ballad's elaborate portrayal of Mulan's cross-dressing. First, from a man to a woman, and then from a woman to a man. With the image of the hair, the gender which is difficult to tell as they are not subjected to the trappings of civilization, that is clothes. The ballad seems to suggest a point of view that is surprisingly progressive. That is, gender is a cultural construct manifested by signs such as fashion and may not be so fundamental or essential to the actions or capabilities of an individual. Later, Mulan's story was constantly reinvented during the transitional period, and she gained the surname Hua in later versions of her story. Disney selected this Chinese legend as the basis of its classic 1998 movie Mulan. This movie is an example of pop feminism of the 1990s. Yet, if you still remember, similar to the other Disney fairy tales, Mulan's story in the movie is very much defined by her romantic relationship with a Prince Charming, that is General Li, a character nowhere to be found in the original ballad or later adaptations of the story in the Chinese tradition. On this point, we may sense the limits of pop feminism in mainstream American culture. On the note of this past-present comparison, let's conclude this lecture. Please complete the quiz first and then watch the next video. There, we'll focus on the cultural history of the South during the period of division and the writing and life of a woman writer from the period, Xie Daoyun. Although she didn't fight on the battleground like Mulan, Xie Daoyun was celebrated as a woman more capable than men for her literary genius and demonstrated incredible courage when facing a life or death crisis.